of your divine knowledge, and open the eyes of our minds to understand your gospel teachings. Implant also in us the fear of your most blessed commandments, so that trampling down all carnal desires, we may enter upon a spiritual manner of living, both thinking and doing such things that are well pleasing unto thee. For you are the illumination of our souls and bodies, O Christ our God. And unto thee do we ascribe all glory, together with your Father who is from everlasting, and your all holy, good, and life-creating Spirit, now and ever and unto the ages of ages. Okay. So tonight we are going to be speaking about a saint from the 5th century. And for those of you who haven't been in the catechesis yet, we are doing a series of talks about a saint from each century, starting from the time of Christ, all the way up to our present day, because every age has their saints. And when we want to learn about the theology of the Orthodox Church, the best way is to see how the faith was lived out by different people. And we'll see that every age had its own challenge, and the Holy Church that Christ established was able to overcome it, or able to navigate themselves through the difficulties of their time, and they used their faith, their understanding of God and their love for God to find meaning in their life and in their environment. And tonight we have a very interesting environment. We have the British Isles and a saint, Saint Patrick, who's very famous, but he's not usually famous for the right things. Most of us experience or hear about Saint Patrick when we see people lying on the streets drunk, wearing green hats and stuff. That's has very little to do with Saint Patrick, and more to do with the Irish drinking habits. But we're going to speak about the real Saint Patrick, and also about the history of Christianity in the British Isles, because it's really fascinating. And it's something it's quite a difficult history, because there aren't so many there's not so much archaeological evidence, but yet when you put all the pieces together, it's a beautiful tapestry how Christianity came to the British Isles, and how people like Saint Patrick, one of the great missionary saints, brought Christianity primarily to Ireland, the island of Ireland. So let me share the screen and just shout. Please do shout if you can't see something or hear anything. Okay.
I would like to ask a question.
No problem.
Are you going to read my messages after the catechist lesson?
No problem. Yes, I'll have time afterwards. So I'll do
All
that.
right, thank you, Father.
No problem. Okay, hopefully you guys can see. Can you see something being shared? Let's double check. Okay. Can anyone see a picture? Can they maybe describe it to me? Remember to switch on your microphone.
Hi, hello, Father Chrysostomos. It looks like a 4-wheel cart pulled by 2 oxen, or
yes, I think it's a toy made of tin, and it comes from the Levant, so it comes from modern day Israel, some kind of tin toy or ornament or something. But the interesting thing is that this was found in an archaeological site, but when they scanned the tin, and it comes from the time of Christ, when they scanned the isotopes or whatever of the tin, it comes from a tin mine in Cornwall. So archaeologists can know that even in the ancient world, tin was being mined and transported all the way to places like ancient Israel and Judea. And this gives us a glimpse into how. Sorry.
I see you not on slide. I can hear myself. You still.
There we go.
Put my.
Okay. Can still hear me? Okay. How the ancient world was connected through trade routes, and especially thanks to the Romans, who managed to unite a lot of different places. And the thing is, tin played a very important role in certain alloys, like copper alloys and things like that, to stop things rusting so quickly. So it was a highly sought after metal, and there happened to be a mine in England that people knew about. And there's even a legend that Joseph of Arimathea had some dealings there, and that he actually went to preach the gospel there in on the lower part of what is now England. But that's often debated. So, and the Greeks even referred to England as the Kassiterides, which is the Tin Islands, because that's what they were known for. But in general, for a person living in Rome or a person living in the Middle East, the British Isles was like a magical, faraway place that mostly people had just heard of, or the most veteran traders maybe had been there, but it was really the edge of the world in their eyes. So, but what's amazing is that Christianity did actually get to England, and quite early. So it's very interesting. The Romans actually entered into Britain, let's just say to conquer it, in the year AD 43. So about 10 years after the resurrection of Christ. So Christianity was only beginning to spread at this time, but Rome began to make its inroads into England and set up its own cities. One of them was Londinium, which is now London, and places like York. And they were often close to large rivers like the Thames, so that they could continue to trade and sail up into these places. And as we know, very early on, there were many Christians among the Romans, among the Roman soldiers, among the Roman traders. And so we know that Christianity must have found its way into England with the Roman occupation of England. The Britons who were living there, the ones who would trade with the Romans, would begin to incorporate their religions as well and their gods. And one of the gods that they started to hear about was this god Christos. Oftentimes people liken early England, Roman England, to like India of today, in its religious, let's just say, landscape, because there would be multiple kind of like cults that people would follow. And so Christianity was just one of these religions that was here. Now, of course, the Christians were teaching that this was the true faith. But you could find, Christians living among people following Roman gods and others following Norse gods, etc., etc. And we know that the Romans had quite an impact on England. I mean, if you go to London today, you can even find Roman structures. It's about 8 meters below the current ground surface, but there's certain sites that you can find with Roman buildings. The town Bath was developed by the Romans as a kind of for its hot springs. So it has its origins also really with the Romans. Yes, so Christianity came to England through the Romans. Now the Romans lasted till about 410. Now there's an interesting person who happened to also find his way into England, and that is Constantine the Great, right? Who became a saint of the church. He was the first Roman emperor. At the end of his life, he became a Christian, but during his life, he was converted to Christus, the true God, by his mother, Helen, but also through his experience of Christ's divine intervention in his military campaigns. Now, it's interesting, Constantine's, the beginning of his journey to become the Roman emperor actually began in England, because his father, also Constantine, was fighting up on the Hadrian Wall, which was a wall built by Hadrian to... oh, sorry, I'm just going to let someone in. Sorry about that. Please do let me know. Okay. Sorry, I've switched my sound off because it was echoing. Okay, hopefully you can... Okay, everyone. So Constantine began his campaign, his journey, what happened was when Constantine's father died, he was in York in the year 306. Constantine started his campaign to become the new emperor from Britain, and he marched with his army all the way to Italy, modern-day Italy, to establish himself as the emperor. And he had to fight Albinus, and he ultimately became the emperor. And we could say that this was a divinely, let's just say, he had divine assistance from our Lord God and Savior Jesus Christ, who providentially wanted to bring the Roman Empire to Christ, and he did it through Constantine. As many problems as Constantine had in his personal life, he was followed and he was obedient to his call to Christ. And so it's interesting that began really in England when he began his march to Rome. Now, another interesting artifact that you can find, this is one of my favorite Roman floor mosaics, Christian floor mosaics, and it happened to come from England, from the town of Dorset, in a Roman villa that was built there. Unfortunately, the archaeologists broke it up to move it, and only the central piece is kept now in the British Museum. It's the image of Christ. You can see the Chiro sign behind him and the pomegranates representing eternal life. But this is actually a Roman mosaic in England. So there were wealthy Roman Christians in England in between the 1st and 5th century. And along with that, we know that there were some bishops. Now, for example, Constantine the Great, when he organized the first ecumenical council, he invited 1,800 bishops to attend the first ecumenical council. It's amazing. So he sent out a survey, and he had 1,800 bishops to invite. Only there were 800 bishops in the West and 1,000 bishops in the East. The Eastern Church, being Asia Minor, Syria, Egypt, and beyond, had far more churches, far more bishops. It was a far more established church. The Western Church was far more sparse. Because of the infrastructure, and the culture was not as rich, let's just say. But we do know that he did invite English bishops. So they did exist. And this was in the year, 325. So there were English bishops, probably in York, in Londinium, etc., etc. But because they were so far, they were unable to actually attend. The furthest bishop was a bishop from Gaul. I forgot his name. So modern-day France. Some bishops from France did attend, and they probably had connections with the bishops in England. So there was Christianity in England, although it wasn't the majority religion for sure in the 5th century, but it was present. But then something happened on the island of England. The Roman presence in England began to wane, and this was primarily because in the 5th century there was the garrison, so the army in Britain, the Roman army in Britain, rebelled under Constantine III, which is a soldier, and he was appointed emperor. Also, again, kind of following that pattern, but the rebellion didn't last, and Rome was unable to reestablish its power in England, in Britain, and so basically the Roman control of the southern part of the English island kind of dissipated. Okay, and so then what happened was these tribes from the mainland, who were constantly coming to England, to Britain, found it much easier. There was this kind of like lapse in any kind of authority, and so they found it much easier to come and raid or come and take control. There's even some arguments that some of the local leaders in Britain, in England, actually invited these Viking-esque Saxons and Angles. They were called Saxons and Angles. I'll show you the map now, how they came, to come into the island and to usurp some kind of control, assert their control there. So if you look at this map, you can see the Angles and the Jutes. They came in and established themselves. Now, the problem for Christians was that these were not Christians. These were pagans, Germanic pagans who brought their own religions with them. And so it also saw a kind of disintegration of Christianity in this region of the British Isles, right? Where you see the Anglo-Saxons come. And they even had, so it was a type of Norse paganism. So they had, their main god was Woden, which was similar to Odin, and Tunor, which comes from Thor. So you can see the kind of connection, just like the Greeks and the Romans, you know, you have like Zeus and then you have Jupiter, etc. So, but Christianity still remained. And what was interesting is that the Christians on the western side of the British Isles became isolated from the rest of Christendom. They were isolated from the Gaulish church, the Roman church, etc. So they became this kind of insular, what we call the insular church. Sometimes people call it the Celtic church, because the culture of the people, the Britons, was Celtic. Now we must remember, Celtic was not indigenous to England. The Celts were all over Europe, but they were kind of driven out by different groups. And so their last, you could say, stronghold of culture, it was more a culture than a people, was in Britain and Ireland and what is modern day Scotland. So this we call the Celtic fringe. And among these people, although there were many pagans, they were Christians. And these Christians had received, let's just say, the first call, right, of the early church to follow Christ. And they followed it with great zeal, and we hear about them. So, for example, there's an interesting monk, Gildas, who writes about these Roman Christians, let's just say Romano-British Christians, who remained faithful. And there's even a legend about a man called Ambrosius, he was a Christian, who led a kind of rebellion against these Anglo-Saxons that came and conquered this land, these pagans. And he was a Christian, and he had this, and he becomes the prototype for the story of King Arthur. So he's kind of the real King Arthur. But we don't know much about him. But his name is Ambrosius, and he was this mighty Christian warrior who fought the Anglo-Saxons. But ultimately, it became pagan again. And so Christianity began to flourish in isolation. In places like Ireland, where it was far more remote, in places like Wales, and in the Hebrides and in Scotland and places like that. And oftentimes, it was a very much, how can I say, this Christianity, although it had its roots within the early church, and we know for a fact that they even had connections with the spiritual writings from Egypt. And I'll show you an example of that. But so the stories of the Desert Fathers, which was contemporary of that time, had come to England. And so it inspired many Christians to seek out this life of prayers, life of isolation. And this region became perfect for that. So, and especially Ireland, right? So, and we see this, I forgot the name of this monastery. I'm sure you guys recognize it from somewhere else, but it actually was a Christian monastery. Skellig Michael, so the Archangel Michael monastery, is just an example of one of the kind of isolated monasteries that became very, very famous for all European Christians, in fact, because it became a place where people could seek out absolute isolation. And we must also remember that during this period, it was a very violent and very tumultuous period in Europe and everywhere. There was constant threat of the Western Roman Empire was crumbling. There were barbarians coming from every direction, and so Christians were seeking out places of solitude where they could pray and remove themselves from the world. And so the Celtic fringe, Ireland, etc., became one of these places. Although there were pagans living there, it was generally peaceful, not as violent as other places. And so it became this kind of sanctuary of Christianity. And we see multiple saints that sprung up, these hermits and wonder workers that were all over. And it's interesting, even in the Orthodox calendar today, if you follow any Orthodox calendar that has a full list of saints for each day, almost every day you can find what's called a Celtic or British saint. So they had multiple saints from this period, men and women, mostly monastics, but all types. Became these shining lights of Christianity. One of them, for example, was Saint Ninian, who became the enlightener of what is now Scotland. Right, the Picts.
Father, the slide
he
seems
was a
to be
Briton.
stuck.
His family was a Romanized Briton who found Christianity through that. And Ninian went to Rome to study to become a priest. He was ordained a bishop, and he went back to the Picts and he preached the gospel to them and established the church there in what's the northern part of England. What's really interesting, sorry, I must let someone in. Okay, sorry about that.
Father, the slides seem to be stuck.
What's really interesting is that they found in 2006, so there's some amazing finds. They found a Psalter, so a book of the Psalter, of the Psalms, from about the year 800. So it's not that old in terms of early church, but it's very old. And in it, although it's written in Latin, this particular manuscript found was buried in a peat bog in Tipperary in Ireland, and it had fragments of Egyptian papyrus. So they can trace that some of this book was written from materials in Egypt itself. And so there was a connection with, even then, with the Far Eastern Church and the Western Church on the very fringes. And what is really interesting is that these monasteries, etc., that sprung up in these regions became famous for their, let's just say, their wealth of manuscripts, etc., and they made huge scriptoriums where they would copy scripture and sacred writings. And actually, this became one of the kind of, how can I say, not sanctuary, but well, a sanctuary of learning. When Central Europe began to decline, it was Irish monks actually who went to bring learning back into Western Europe. We'll learn about that a bit. So it's really fascinating. So now what happened was, in about the year 600, the Christianity started to re-enter back into the mainland of England. So I'm sorry I'm giving you guys a whole lesson of Christianity in England, but it's interesting because it'll help us understand St. Patrick better. Okay, what was happening during his time and after. So remember, this section, this red section of England was pagan still. There were Christians. Some of the kings had accepted Christianity, but in general, it was pagan still. And we have now Christianity, although it's not the majority religion, it's spread now in an organic, natural way, deeply becoming part of the experience of people in Ireland, along the Britons in the Celtic fringe, and the Picts, which are the Scots, in the north. And something happens where now Rome learns about this, the island of England, and that there's still pagans there that need to be brought to Christ. And so there becomes this kind of like movement of missionaries from the east, from Rome. It's kind of weird because you think of east as far east. From Rome in the east, missionaries coming, and we're going to learn about them. And then missionaries now traveling from Ireland back to the mainland to convert the people back to Christ. And this becomes the Christianization of England. Really, officially, people say it comes in the year 600, okay, although it started 2 centuries prior in a more organic and less organized way. So let's talk a little bit more about the blossoming Celtic Christianity. Now, I already mentioned that the Celtic Christianity became this kind of sanctuary of learning, of prayer, of real Christian life. And even, for example, it was a bit later, but in the French royal court in the Carolingian period, so when Charlemagne was present, he would often invite Irish monks to come and teach his court and set up various monasteries. So they would also travel and teach people about writing, etc. Remember, in the Western Church, in the Western Europe, the church became the kind of the vessel through which learning happened. The Eastern Roman Empire remained up until 1054. But in the West, there was no more Roman Empire. So the church was the let's just say the place where you could receive learning, education, etc. And so the Irish monks became famous for that. And these missionaries would often travel very far from these various regions to spread the gospel. Some of these saints, Saint Cuthbert, Saint David of Wales. Now they come from those early Christians, the Britons who took on Christianity when the Romans were there and the early Christians came, and they had a different kind of spirit. What we love so much about the Celtic saints is their ability to bring Christianity into the language of the people and the culture of the people and the nature of the people. So it wasn't like something that was imposed. We think of Christianity like in Africa as this kind of colonial endeavor where they used the church as a kind of tool, to make people Englishmen or something like that, the Anglican Church. Well, these particular saints had received Christianity in an organic way through Christians coming with the Romans and then established themselves within the land. And so the way they preached, the way they interacted with their pagan neighbors naturally brought them closer and closer to the Christian experience. And we'll see that with St. Patrick especially. And that's what makes it so fascinating. They would incorporate certain aspects of what the Celtic culture was about and incorporate it into Christianity. I'll tell you a few of them. So one of the fascinating things that we see, especially in the Celtic Church, was this what's called the Peregrinatio pro Christo, which is the kind of going into exile for Christ. Now, one of the reasons why some people think Christians did that in the British Isles was although there was a lot of violence, and the Vikings, will get into that later and everything. But in general, in Ireland, for example, there wasn't so much persecution like coming from the Roman emperors and the early church, etc. So Christians often wanted to dedicate their life to Christ, to die for Christ, and the only way they could become a type of martyr was to go into exile. And this became called the White Martyrdom, where Christians would leave their homeland in Ireland. They would either go to a different country in Ireland, or they would do what is a greater pilgrimage, where they would get onto a boat and sail away into the distance with faith and allow the Holy Spirit to take them where they needed to go. And that's often how many of these missions started. It's amazing. You hear some stories of the saints that would get onto a little coracle, like a little round boat, and just set off, and where they would land, they would take that as where God wanted them to be. And then you get legends like the story of Saint Brendan the Navigator, and various other stories of saints traveling along the ocean, bringing Christianity back to the British Isles, for example, and other places, Newfoundland even. So it's very interesting. And that became a specific hallmark of Celtic Christianity, was this pilgrimage, exile for Christ. So you'd have these wandering people, these pilgrims, who basically left everything, all security, to be with Christ. Okay. Another thing I can say, although we'll speak about it with St. Patrick, is that unlike in the Eastern Church and the mainland Roman Church, the monasteries actually became the highest seats of power in the Celtic Church. So what does that mean? So, for example, in the Eastern Orthodox Church, the bishops in the diocese would have the highest authority, and they would run the church. Well, in the Irish Church, it was mostly the abbots of the monasteries, because these were really the centers of administration in the church. So that was also a different hallmark of Celtic Saint Gregory the Great. He was the Bishop of Rome, the Pope of Rome. A lot of people get confused when I start calling people popes. There's nothing wrong with the word pope. Pope means papa, means father. Bishop. He was a bishop of Rome. Saint, he's a saint in the Orthodox Church as well. Rome had not yet gone into heresy, so he was a Pope of Rome and a great missionary himself, and a great saint. And there's a story that goes that one day he was in Rome and there was a slave market there, and he was walking through and he saw these young Britons, or they were already then called Angles from the Anglo-Saxons, and he was marveling at them. You know, they were very pale and had these nice blonde hair. And he said, "Who are these young men?" Like, and someone said to them, "They are Angli. They are of the Angli." And then he said the famous words, "Non Angli sed angeli." He said, "No, they're not Anglis, they're angels, because they look kind of like angels." And so then he learned about these people on this island, and he thought these were like angelic people, and he couldn't believe that they were still pagans at that time. And so he began a mission from Rome to bring those people back to Christ. So I'm going to let someone in. Okay. You're all on here. So begins the Roman mission to England. So we see these two sides now coming to convert. And so Pope Gregory the First, Gregory the Great, by the way, I just wanted to mention, we still serve a liturgy, the Liturgy of Pre-Sanctified Gifts, that was written by Gregory the Great. So his theology, his writings still exist within the Orthodox Church, and he's a loved saint by us as well. So he sent a bishop from Rome, Augustine, not Augustine of Hippo, it's a different Augustine, to establish Christianity in East England, in Canterbury. And he became the first bishop of Canterbury and the bishop of England. And this was Roman Christianity coming back into the British Isles. And he was very successful. Now, the interesting thing about this mission was that Augustine slowly began to convert the kings of the various kingdoms within England. Beginning with, it's a very Ethelbert. His wife was already a Christian, and so he was able to convince him to become a Christian. And slowly, these Anglo-Saxon kingdoms became Christian. Now, it took a long time for them to start acting Christian, let's just say that. But we see beautiful stories of these people becoming Christians. But what's interesting is that there was already a church there, the Celtic church. There were still Christians there. Now, the Roman mission was quite shocked because they said, why have you guys allowed paganism to continue here? Why are you not more active in your mission? They had already become quite enculturated, the church, and they were living alongside one another. And it even it rings to the story of King Arthur, you know. Who did King Arthur go visit? Merlin. Merlin was like a druid, but Arthur was a Christian. So there was this interesting relationship between pagan England and the local Celtic church, let's just say. And the Romans didn't like this. The Romans were like, we need to convert these people to Christ. Now, and in many ways they were right, and they were very successful. And the Venerable Bede, which was a writer of the story of the Church of Christendom in England, actually explained that oftentimes there was conflict between these two groups of Christians. Now, and one thing that happened was the Roman Church had less respect for these local Celtic Christians. And there's even a story that Augustine, the Bishop of Canterbury, organized a meeting with the native clergy, so those Christians that had been Christians since the 4th century, to come. And they met under an oak tree. And he asked them to come now under the Church of Rome, basically. And so before they went to this meeting, they went to a hermit. So this already sounds like they're much more orthodox than the Roman Church, but that's just my opinion. They went to a hermit living in isolation and asked him, what should we do? Should we go under the Roman Church? We're one church, And if Augustine stands when you come to meet him, when he's at the oak, then go under the Roman Church. But if he doesn't stand, then don't follow him. And he didn't stand, which showed that he had disrespect for these local Christians, and so they chose not to come under the Roman Church. And so for a number of centuries, there was this kind of conflict between the local insular Christians of the early church and the Roman mission. Now, that's not to say that there weren't amazing saints, and what we see is that many of the saints coming from the Celtic fringe, people like Cuthbert, Aidan, founding these amazing monasteries in the north, they cooperated with the Roman mission, but they themselves had the spirituality of the early church, and that's why we find them so inspiring. We find their spirituality, their mysticism, their prayers that we have very much in line with orthodoxy. Not to say that we don't. We also celebrate Saint Augustine of Canterbury as one of our saints, among many others from the Roman mission. And Gregory himself was a saint in the church. Yet we recognize that there was something very special, something very orthodox about this local Celtic church and the saints that came from it. There's even a story that Venerable Bede speaks about, and I find this very interesting. When the Anglo-Saxons were still trying to assert their control, and they were fighting King Ethelfrith. King Ethelfrith was a pagan Anglo-Saxon fighting against the Christian ruler. I'm sorry, I don't know the king's names, and someone can correct me with this. And so he saw a monastery in the battle. I think it was Chelsea, I can't remember. And there was hundreds of monks, 1,200 monks within these monasteries, praying for that the Christian king would win. And so Ethelfrith recognized this, and this is what he says. He said, if then they cry to their God against us, so as in they're praying to their God against us, in truth, though they don't bear arms, yet they fight against us, because they oppose us by their prayers. And then he commanded his army to go into the monasteries and to kill all the monks. So it's interesting, this pagan king recognized the power of the monks and their prayer, and that and he saw them as like warriors. Although they had no swords, they had no axes, he sent his army to kill all the monks because they were praying to their God against him. And it rings true about what's happening all the time. We were talking now on the WhatsApp group about these killings of monks and priests in our time, and there is a spiritual battle going on. And this pagan recognized that these Christians who were praying, these monastics who were praying, were enemies of him. This pagan, he was worshiping a pagan demon basically, and so he fought against them. And Bede wrote this, that this was a punishment to the local Christians, the Celtic Christians, for not coming under Rome. Well, we'll see if we want to interpret it that way. But this is a modern icon painted by Edenhart of Saint Bede, or the Venerable Bede. He never left his cell. He never left this monastery. The Venerable Bede wrote the history of the Church of England, but he himself had this calling of just being insular, learning and praying in isolation. Very interesting stuff. So in the year 664, we see the church now coming together and deciding in the Council of Whitby, or the Synod of Whitby in 664, to come under the Roman rites, which basically mean the church came under Rome and began to follow the Roman customs. And we see from this...
I'm not sure if the slides are changing.
Can you guys see the slides? Let me double check. Can you see the slides?
Now, yes. Now, yes.
Oh, it's okay. We don't really need the slides, although they are pretty cool. So sorry about that.
Yeah, they've changed now.
Okay, I see the slides are stuck. I'll send you guys the I have all these cool like Viking slides, but anyway, I'll send you to them later. So the church came under the Roman rights, and we see that this was the beginning. The 7th century was, we could say, the start of the waning of the cultic tradition, Christianity, as the church became more Roman. Let me just double check about the slides. Are they working now? Can you see them? Okay.
I think they're working, Father.
So you guys can see the slides. This is an example, that's actually a print, unfortunately, of some of the amazing, let's just say, results of cultic Christianity was the Gospels, the illuminated Gospels that were copied and written in these great monasteries of Lindisfarne and Cowles, etc. And so we see the great, and you can go to the British Library and see this in person, these books. And I've been there and I've seen them, and I couldn't believe a human being made these books, because you can't really see, but if you look at the illumination and the lines and the knotwork, this cultic knotwork, I can't believe a hand could actually make this, so it had extreme skill, extreme sense of beauty, but this was and it was all translated into Christianity through the material culture as well. Now this also became made the monasteries susceptible to those who weren't let's just say interested in the beauty of Christ and the church, but rather interested in the riches that the monasteries held. That's in the Viking Age. That happened 100 years later. But this is, we see kind of the waning of the Celtic Church, although it still continued in many great saints from that time. But we see that the landscape of Christianity began to change. So that was a primer about how Christianity came to England and how ultimately England became Christian. Now, there's a whole story about the conversion of all the kings and how the Vikings invaded in the 7th century. And in fact, I think it was the year 780, the Vikings came from the Norsemen, so from what is like Norway, Sweden, those places, Denmark. They came back to the island, and they began to see these monasteries. And the first monastery they sacked was this monastery of Lindisfarne, which is where this gospel was made. And they killed all the monks. And basically, you can still see the ruins of that monastery of Lindisfarne today on the island of Lindisfarne. And this was a great shock to the Christians of the British Isles, and there was this huge, how can I say, conflict now of survival, where the Christians didn't want to have what happened to them in the 5th century, when the Anglo-Saxons came and brought paganism back. And so there's this amazing story. Some of it is related in that series Vikings, which is very violent and not very pro-Christian. It's actually but it does give you some interesting snippets of that history, which is very violent. But ultimately, Christianity prevailed, and England became a Christian country. And by the time of Henry VIII, England was very much Christianized and peaceful. There was no more fighting and things like that. So now we're going to dial it back a little bit, and we're going to speak about Saint Patrick. He was from the 5th century, and see how he began part of his mission in Ireland. So I'm going to jump right in. Okay. So his early.
Hey,
So
my
Patrick
father.
was born in Britain, so not in Ireland. He was not Irish. He was from the mainland Britain in the year 386. We don't know much of his life. We know from his own confession that he wrote, that most scholars believe was his, where he's from, who his parents were. His father was Calphurnius, which is a Roman name. He was a deacon from a Roman family and of quite high social rank. And his mother's name was Concessa, who was a relative of Saint Martin of Tours. So that's very interesting. A French saint, Gaulish saint. And also his grandfather was a member of the clergy. But it's interesting, Patrick himself was kind of like, he didn't respect his parents. So he wasn't really a very dedicated Christian. It sounds like Christians today. Their great grandparents are Christians, but he didn't think it was that worthy of following. So, and he writes this in his, and this you'll see here in the red writing. This is what Patrick himself wrote, talking about his early life. So he says this: I, Patrick, by the way, our cat Patrick literally just walked into the room, so that's a sign. He says, this is what Patrick wrote in his confession. He said, I, Patrick, a sinner, most rustic, the least of all the faithful, and utterly despised of many. My father was Calpurnius, a deacon, son of Pocius, a priest of the village of Banavern, Tabernia. We don't know where that was exactly. He had a county seat nearby, and I was taken captive. He says, I was then about 16 years of age. I did not know the true God, and I was taken into captivity to Ireland with many thousands of people, and deservedly so, because we turned away from God. I did not keep his commandments. I did not obey our priests, who used to remind us of our salvation. And the Lord brought us the wrath of his anger and scattered us among the many nations, even unto the utmost part of the earth, where now my littleness is placed among strangers. So when Patrick was 16 years old, raiders from Ireland came, so kind of like what you would call maybe pirates, slave pirates. And this was a thing that definitely happened, where they would kind of swoop in with ships, grab a whole bunch of people from the villages, take them back, and they would force them to slavery. And this happened to Patrick. And he is now writing later on in his life this confession. He wrote this letter defending his mission to the Irish, to the Romans. We'll discuss that a bit later. But basically, Patrick became a slave. Interesting. And he was a shepherd. He writes about it here. He was a shepherd, and I want to read rather what he writes himself, and then we can talk about it. But in his later life, he recognized this was God's plan for his life. And he said he was grateful because he didn't know the true God. He didn't listen to his parents. And so God put him in this journey, in this hardship. And he said this is now what he writes in confession. I didn't deserve at all that the Lord would grant such a great grace after hardships and troubles, after captivity, and after so many years among that people, so the Irish. It was something which, when I was young, I never hoped for, even thought of. After I arrived in Ireland, I tended sheep every day, and I prayed fervently during the day. More and more the love of God increased, and my sense of awe before God. Faith grew, and my spirit was moved, so that in one day I would pray up to 100 times, and at night perhaps the same. I even remained in the woods or in the mountain, and I would rise to pray before dawn in snow and ice and rain. I never felt the worse for it. I never felt lazy. As I realize now, the Spirit was burning in me at that time. So from Patrick's own account, when he was a shepherd now as a slave, as a shepherd in Ireland, forced to tend these sheep, it was there he started to burn this desire to pray. Before, he didn't have it when he wasn't in hardship with his family, his rich family, but now he did. And he was praying constantly in the day and in the nights. It's kind of a ceaseless prayer. And that fire of faith in him allowed him to pray in any weather. And he realized, and I think this experience that Patrick had is what later made him want to go back to Ireland. It's the place where he found God. And so he wanted the other people of Ireland to have that same experience. So then he started to have these dreams about escaping. And this is what he says. He had this dream and this voice that promised him that he would find a way home to Britain. And this is what he says. It was there one night in my sleep that I heard a voice saying to me, you have fasted well. Very soon you will return to your native country. Again, after a short while, I heard someone saying to me, look, your ship is ready. It was not nearby, but a good 200 miles away. I'd never been to the place, nor did I know anyone there. So I ran away then and left the man with whom I had been for 6 years. It was in the strength of God that I went. God who turned the direction of my life to good. I feared nothing while I was on the journey to that ship. So he could have been killed, obviously, if he was found. So he had this dream calling him back. You have fasted well, it says. So this was kind of like a trial that God had sent Patrick on. And now he had refound his faith. And now he went back. He was sailed on the ship back to the mainland. So the vessel actually was going back to France, right? And this is his story about more adventures he had when they were sailing on the ship, because the ship got stuck, made it to land, but it was in the middle of nowhere. So he says this: after 3 days, we made it to land. And then for 28 days, we traveled through the wilderness. Food ran out and great hunger came over them. So all the people from the ship. And the captain turned to me and said, "What about us, Christian? You tell us that your God is great and all-powerful. Why can't you pray for us, since we are in a bad state with hunger? There's no sign of us finding a human being anywhere." Then I said to them with some confidence, "Turn in faith with all your hearts to the Lord my God, because nothing is impossible for him, so that he may put food in your way, even enough to make you fully satisfied. He has an abundance everywhere with the help of God." This is actually what happened. A herd of pigs appeared in the way before our eyes. They killed many of them, and they remained for 2 nights and were fully restored, and the dogs too were filled. Many of them had grown weak and left half alive by the way. After this, they gave great thanks to God, and I was honored in their eyes. So miraculously, this herd of pigs came and they ate. So this is one of the miraculous things that happened with Patrick's prayer. So then Patrick goes back, he finds his family, he makes his way back to Britain, but now he's called to serve the church. He's called to become a priest and a bishop. And so he goes to serve. He went to France to study. Now, France or Gaul was more, let's just say, had more infrastructure, more places to study, etc., etc. And he went under the guidance of Saint Germanus, a missionary, and he was ordained a deacon in 418 by the Bishop of Auxerre. And then later he was consecrated as a bishop in Rome. So he went to Rome as a bishop. And he was blessed by Pope Celestine to do mission work in Ireland. But ultimately, the Roman Church didn't give him a dispensation to go to Ireland. And there is a canon in the Orthodox Church. Rome is still Orthodox. In the Orthodox Church, a bishop was not meant to leave his diocese where he was serving as bishop, right? And so Patrick didn't have permission to go to Ireland to start his mission. But he did so anyway. He kind of defied them. And so what he did was, after he had gone to Ireland and started this mission and became the bishop, let's just say, ordaining priests, etc., he wrote the Confessio, the Confession of St. Patrick, which basically defended his choice to leave Rome, to leave France, and to become a mission to the Irish people. And so I suggest to many of you to read that. We're going to read a bit more from that, because it shows his great love for the Irish people and his missionary spirit, that he couldn't allow those people in Ireland to not find Christ. Okay, so we're going to read about that. So this is what he says in his defense. Now, he's saying this to the Romans, what his experience was, why he should become a missionary. So he says this: I've said enough about that, about his life. I must take care not to hide the gift of God which he has generously given us in the land of my captivity, so Ireland. It was then that I looked for him with all my strength, and there I found him, and he protected me from all evils. This is what I believe. On account of his spirit living and working in me to this very day, I am proud to tell again of this. God knows, if there was some other person who had said this to me, perhaps I would have said nothing, because of the love of Christ. So I will never stop giving thanks to my God, who kept me faithful in the time of my temptation. I can today with confidence offer my soul to Christ my Lord as a living victim. He is the one who defended me in all my difficulties when he was in Ireland. So this is what I want to continue reading, what he wrote in his defense. Now he's very humble. He's a very humble bishop, although he's now converted many people to the faith, and he's now writing to Rome, already having established the Irish church. He says, I know that I'm an inexperienced in all things, but still I have tried to keep a guard on myself and for the Christians and virgins of Christ and religious women who were giving me small gifts of their own accord. He's now defending his ministry. When they would throw some of their ornaments on the altar, I would give them back to them. They would hurt at me that I would do this, but it was because the hope of the eternal gift that I was careful in all things, in case unbelievers would trap me in ministry of service for any reason. Nor did I want to give those who could believe even the slightest reason for speaking against me or take my character away. Perhaps, however, when I baptized so many thousands of people, that I hope to receive even the smallest payment. If so, tell me and I will return it to you. Or when the Lord ordained clerics everywhere through my poor efforts, and I gave their service to them for free, if I asked them to pay even for the cost of my shoes, tell it against me and I will return it to you and more. So he's saying that he did all of this not to gain any type of wealth, but for pure intentions. Now, Patrick, it was interesting in that Patrick was very much able to, when he brought Christianity to the chieftains and these various clans, right? The Irish are famous for their clans. He was very much able to convert the leaders of that, and even oftentimes the religious leaders, the druids of the pagan religions. He would actually, once they would be baptized, he would make the druids become the bishops or the priests, the overseers of the communities. And by doing so, he created this kind of seamless transition from paganism to Christianity. And he used many of the local symbolism and stuff to bring people to Christ. Now, this doesn't mean that he syncretized anything, and you can read that in his confession how his theology was so strong. He was a champion of the Trinity, which at this particular time was being defended in the East in the great councils of Nicaea and Constantinople. Patrick was on the edge of the world, teaching about the Holy Trinity and about the divinity of Christ. So he was very much not, not kind of making compromises in his faith. And he did come into lots of danger. His prayer that we'll read at the end, the breastplate of St. Patrick, was a prayer to protect priests against danger from various pagan clans that wanted to kill him. And he even speaks about his 12 dangers that he went through. So that's a kind of mystery of the 12 great adventures he had when he was delivered from being killed. So Patrick was not, let's just say, without threat to his life, and miraculously he was never killed, but he did struggle through all of that. What's interesting as well is that the monasteries that Patrick would establish, and the priests and bishops that he ordained, well, the priests that he ordained and the abbots that he ordained, they would form this nucleus, and the villages, etc., would form around it, and very much the monasteries became this kind of this interweaving of kind of village life. And this is a rendition, if the slides are still on, of what a monastery would look like. This is a monastery in Devon. These are the remains of it. You can see it still today. It's very interesting, hey? The tower still exists. But these monasteries became centers of trade, centers of learning, where the young boys would be sent by their parents to go become monastics. And so it was the landscape became kind of Christianized. It was an amazing thing. And you can still see the remnants of that in Patrick's mission in Ireland. And the slides could still be stuck. Okay, let me try. I'll try to get them back. Okay. I think the slides are on again. Okay. So Patrick was able to incorporate a lot of the can someone just write on the group, I don't know if the slides are back. They could be stuck. But anyway. If you can see, I have a Celtic cross here on the screen, an example of one. So Patrick used some of the symbols of the people living there in order to preach about Christ. And one of the things that traditionally is attributed to Patrick is the cultic cross, which is basically a cross with a circle in it. Now, there's a lot of theories about and a depiction of Christ being crucified on it. Now, one of the theories is that one of the cults was to the sun god, and so he kind of tried to incorporate this into the cross. See, Christ is the true sun. You see, so it's very important for us to remember that scoffers today will say, atheists will say, well, you see, Christians were just kind of like, making Christianity kind of paganism. But that's not the case. What Patrick was doing was he was trying to show them who the true sun is, the true sun of righteousness, as we call Jesus Christ. And so he would place the sun on the cross to show, this is the true sun, right? The word of God. And then if you notice, cultic crosses have these kind of beautiful weaves, this cultic weave, the cultic knots. And that actually represents branches. That's it's like growth. And so the cross became a tree. And a tree as well in the pagan world was one of the sacred symbols, right? The sacred tree. And so he's pointing to the cross as the true tree of life. And so he reminded the pagans that the cross of Christ is the tree of life, that they in a shadow were worshipping under, whatever. He showed them, no, now the cross is the true tree, that's part of our teaching as Christians, right? And many other things like the clover, the famous, the shamrock, although it's not sure, it's just one of the traditions. He used that as a kind of way to preach about the Trinity, right? Is a shamrock one leaf or three leaves? So that was a simple way of trying to teach about the Trinity, but apparently he used this as well. So we're almost there, guys. Sorry to keep you so long. But St. Patrick died in the year 461 in Ireland. So he remained there with his people, who became his people now. And this is traditionally the tomb or the place of his burial under this rock here. And we know mostly about him from his own Confessio, and also his letter to Coroticus. And Patrick basically is the patron saint now of Ireland, but also one of the great missionaries of the British Isles. And so just to finish off, before we have some questions, I want to read you the prayer of protection that Patrick wrote for his priests and monks when they would be in danger. So I'm going to read it to you, and then we can finish off. Okay. I've shortened it a little bit, and you'll recognize some of the words. I arise today through a mighty strength, the invocation of the Trinity. Through belief in the threeness, through confession of the oneness of the Creator of creation. I arise today through the strength of Christ's birth with his baptism, through the strength of his crucifixion with his burial, through the strength of his resurrection with his ascension, through the strength of his descent for the judgment of doom. I arise today through the strength of heaven, the light of the sun, the radiance of the moon, the splendor of fire, the speed of lightning, the swiftness of wind, the depth of the sea, the stability of the earth, the firmness of rock. I summon today all these powers between me and those evils, against every cruel and merciless power that may oppose my body and soul, against incantations of false prophets, against black laws of pagandom, against false laws of heretics, against craft of idolatry, against spells of witches and smiths and wizards, against every knowledge that corrupts man's body and soul. Christ, to shield me today, against poison, against burning, against drowning, against wounding, so there may come to me an abundance of reward. Christ with me, Christ before me, Christ behind me, Christ in me, Christ beneath me, Christ above me, Christ on my right, Christ on my left, Christ when I lie down, Christ when I sit down, Christ when I arise, Christ in the heart of every man who thinks of me, Christ in the mouth of everyone who speaks of me, Christ in every eye that sees me, Christ in every ear that hears me. That's the prayer of St. Patrick. The breastplate of St. Patrick. The armor, you can call it the armor of St. Patrick. So, sorry, Jacques very late. Okay, I'm going to turn on my sound. Are there any questions or comments? Sorry, my sound was off, so I couldn't hear anything.
I have a question.
Yes, Nina?
So did Saint Patrick know about the Theotokos and the other saints?
Absolutely. So Patrick was an educated man. He studied in Rome and he studied in France, and you can see through his prayers that he knew about the incarnation. He speaks about the birth of Christ, so he would have known about the Theotokos. And Saint Germanus, he's a saint. The bishop that ordained him is a saint of the church. So he not only knew about the saints, he knew the saints personally. And I think there is a story. Yeah, I mean, he was in a way related to Saint Martin of Tours. So yes, he knew about the Theotokos saints. Alfred, I see a raised hand.
Sorry, that was just earlier for the slides when they were
Slides.
stuck.
Okay, sorry. I'll send a PDF of the slides. Yeah.
Cool.
Are there any other questions or comments or objections?
I also have a other question.
Yes, Ina?
So is like Islam like paganism? Because I saw many ads on my Facebook page about converting to Islam and something like that, but I don't know why. But I just want to know if Islam is like paganism.
According to Saint John of Damascus, Islam is like a heresy, and there are pagan elements to it. But let's save that question to another night. But it's monotheistic, but it's not worshiping the same God. It's not the God that we believe in, the one true God. They may believe in one God, but they may, but the attributes or the way that they understand God is not the same God that revealed himself to us through Jesus Christ. Athanasius, you had a question?
Yes, my question is regarding what you mentioned about King Arthur.
Yes.
I didn't know it was real, or or at least like, yeah. I wanted to know the well, I didn't know he was a Christian, but yeah, I didn't know the history at least. So when you mentioned him there, I was like, oh wait, okay.
Yeah.
Is it more of a story to teach us as Christians something good, or are there historical elements to
Well, so the story of King Arthur was written later. It was written, I think, in like the medieval, like after the year 1000, or during kind of the Crusades. But the fascinating thing about it, this Ambrosius, this figure, is seen by most people as the figure of Arthur, because he was this Christian leader that was fighting against paganism and seeking the Holy Grail. Which, I mean, we can interpret it in different ways, but basically it harkens to that period of that early Christian period where they were Christians isolated now, living among these Anglo-Saxons. They were Anglo-Saxons themselves. They were mixed together with them, but they were Christians that were living, that had been already Christianized during the early Roman period in the 3rd, 4th century. The 4th and 5th century. And so there was this kind of memory and this experience of the early church in England, which was kind of elaborated, and the great adventures of these Christians, which then was kind of put into a story or gathered together into a story about these pious monk-like warriors, right, who went and sought after the Holy Grail, went to the Holy Land, etc., like that. So there's elements of truth to all of that. I mean, there were great adventures by these early Christians. Brendan the Navigator, Patrick himself had many great adventures, and so there was that element. But it was crystallized and romanticized during the Crusade period.
Okay,
there are historical roots to that. Yeah, there's not much information. It's very mysterious. It's very interesting. But even the fact that they have figures like Merlin, this druid, it harkens to an earlier period of Christianity, where
Yeah, no, it makes sense. And then my second question was also regarding the Anglican Church, where we have Christianity that got to the shores of England pretty early, and they were Orthodox. What do we do now with
The Anglican Church.
yeah, like with post-schism, Henry the because they I mean as a former Anglican, they claim apostolic succession. So what do we do with the Anglican Church that already had I guess Orthodox Christianity on at the shores before the schism, before the Reformation, etc.? Like how do we pass that through?
That's actually the best question we need for tonight, because that's something we need to ask ourselves, because we are Orthodox Christians. How do we deal with Christians in England, the early Christians? So I'll give you some anecdotal opinion from myself. So I was blessed to go to Lindisfarne with Anastasia, my wife, and we were on honeymoon. We went on an Orthodox trip through England, right? Because there are Orthodox sites of great saints from the early church. And we went to Lindisfarne. And it's an amazing place. Of course, the original monastery is in ruins, but it's still very beautiful. And there's Anglican church. There's Anglican churches there, to St. Aidan and things. And some of them are very ancient. But my experience, and I'll just say my experience of going into those Anglican churches, is when you read about the lives of Christians and the spiritual experience of Christians in that time, and then you go to an Anglican church, or you would see a service there, it doesn't connect. You can feel the spiritual power of these saints when you go to these places, and you read about their lives and the mystical life that they had, their asceticism, their prayer life, and that doesn't exist in the Anglican Church anymore. I mean, the Anglican Church now does have monastic orders, but in the reforms of Henry VIII, they removed the monasteries. They almost desacralized the church. They would destroy monasteries, destroy holy relics. They would dig up graves during the Anglican, let's just say the Anglican Reformation, you could say. And they desacralized the church. It became an institution of the crown. So the Anglican Church, even though it has, although it's lost its apostolic succession, actually, if you really look at it with the ordination of people that shouldn't be candidates, I should say it like that. But although they have apostolic succession, they have not continued the faith. So you can't have one but not the other. See, this is a very important thing. You can have a technical apostolic succession through names of bishops, but if they don't have the true faith and the true practice of Christianity, which has various forms, I'm not saying there's one practice, but when they've lost that life of the church, it's really the church no longer embodies that. So, and that's the frustrating thing that I find so much when you go to Anglican churches, is that they commemorate these saints. I mean, there's so many churches to St. Aidan, St. Cuthbert, etc., in the Anglican church, but their spirituality doesn't reflect the spirituality of St. Cuthbert. You're much more likely to experience something like that if you go to Russia, and I'm not just being biased. So, for example, even if you go to the grave of St. Patrick, and that's Catholics, Roman Catholics, there's no like pious custom to go and pray at the graves of the saints anymore. But if you go to the grave of Saint Sergius of Radonezh, you'll see people spending vigil there asking for the intercession of Saint Sergius. And this would be what was happening in England and Ireland today if they had remained within the Orthodox spiritual life. So unfortunately, the Anglican Church, so what happened was this. After the Council of Whitby, the English Church came under Rome. It was no longer insular independent in that sense. And what happened was this created a dependency on Rome. And when Rome fell into schism after 1054, the English Church came with it. Then what happened was Henry VIII, now this is my quick little version, sorry, I mean, there's a lot of people that can explain this much better. Henry VIII, through his own personal desire to remove himself from the papacy. Now, England always felt itself to be independent because of the geography and because of its history and because of the early Christian history, in fact. And his personal problems was having an heir and those things. He divorced himself from the church and he became the head of the English church, the Anglican Church. And after that, of course, it came under more and more Protestant type of reforms. with King James, etc. And so after King James. And so the church became less and less a living, organic church, but a institutional type of church. And you see even now, the Anglican Church plays a very like kind of secular role. It's very much more interested in kind of like what's the political issue of the day than about embodying the life of Christ and the spiritual life. Of course, there's amazing Anglicans, very saintly Anglicans. We shouldn't think that the Anglicans are just terrible people or something. But as a church, I would say that it doesn't embody the fullness of the church. It even has confusion within its own church about the presence of the body and blood of Christ in the Eucharist, about the divinity of Christ. There's even some Anglican bishops and priests who doubt the divinity of Christ. Of course, they're not in a majority, but they exist. And they continue to exist in the church, which is something unthinkable in Orthodoxy. But those saints of the early church, the Celtic church, are our saints. We commemorate them, and it's interesting. When you go to England now, usually the Orthodox Christians living there are the ones going to pray at the graves of these saints. They are the ones who revere the relics of those saints more than the Anglicans. The Anglicans don't know what to do with the saints. They don't even know how to intercede anymore. They don't even really have a sense of intercession anymore. So you can be the best Anglican by becoming Orthodox.
Yeah. Thank you, Father. That was perfect. It makes sense of a lot of things that I've like personally been thinking about.
Yeah, if you go to England now, like I knew we had a young lady come from Bath, from the Church of St. John of Kronstadt in Bath, the Russian Orthodox Church, and they have pilgrimages. They have like a whole variety of saints. Every year they go on a pilgrimage to Worcester Cathedral, to all these amazing sacred sites that the English themselves have forgotten about. But England is an amazing holy place from the early saints. And it's only now through the Orthodox Christians having awareness of this that they're beginning to actually embody that, let's just say.
Yeah. Thank you, Father. Thank you very much for that.
Any other questions?
I have another question.
Yes.
So how did wait, hold on. Like did Saint Paisios say that in 2025 that the large church in Constantinople will be reformed to a church?
There's a lot of prophecies. Paisios did say things about that, but let's save that for another night, because that we fast forwarding now. Probably the 20th century will speak about Saint Paisios, but we've got a few more centuries to go. But yeah, there are some prophecies, but we must be careful about those types of things. We don't want to go to war with Turkey now, right? To get back a church. When every Orthodox church, every church has the fullness of Christ there in it, if it has the true faith. And the Eucharist is the same whether it's in Hagia Sophia or whether it's in a tiny little chapel in the middle of nowhere in Hopefield. So yeah.
Oh, okay.
You can have your own Hagia Sophia in Hopefield. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay. Thank you everyone so much. Have a blessed evening. Romania, do you have a question or just saying bye?
Hi, Father.
Oh, it's
Good
Roman.
morning.
Sorry, I'm like reading your full name here.
Okay, no worries. No, it was interesting that you actually mentioned that the Celtic Church became centers of learning and education. Fast forwarding like a few more years, well, a good couple more years, during the Reformation, where Martin Luther actually made an argument that the Catholic Church was actually not enabling people to worship at church in their own language, and that obviously sparked this whole notion that the Reformation brought about modern day education, so to speak. So yeah, it's more of a point than a question. I just found it quite interesting that you made mention that, and also from a Reformation point of view, Martin Luther actually had an issue with the Catholic Church. But I'm interested to know what his opinion was on the Orthodox Church, based on the information that you gave me tonight.
Well, so look, this is quite far ahead. We will speak about a saint during that time, that an Orthodox saint who did deal with Lutheranism. But the Lutherans did know about Orthodoxy, and they actually, the Tübingen, I don't know how to pronounce it, the scholars, who was like the center point of Lutheranism, let's just say, they wrote letters to the Patriarch of Constantinople asking him to look at their doctrine and to say whether it is right. So they saw the Orthodox as having authority. Although the Orthodox ultimately rejected the Protestant doctrines and teachings and what they wanted to do and how they wanted to leave the church. Although they did agree with a lot of the abuses happening in the Catholic Church at that time, the Orthodox agreed. And I would say part of the sad part about the early English church is that it unfortunately was captive to Rome in a sense, and so it kind of took on the heresies that the Roman Church later had. So yeah, but I think that's also a big topic for another night. Okay, thank you everyone so much. I think we should wrap it up. Gotta have supper. Gotta have your pancakes while you can. Okay, thank you everyone. God bless you, and have a good evening.
Thank you, Father.
Thank you.
Thank you, Father.